The following episode of Intimate Judaism was recorded before the beginning of Israel's war against Iran. Tali and I initially delayed releasing it for that reason. Although the war has not yet ended, we recognize that regular life continues even in the midst of warfare. Therefore, we're releasing this podcast now, along with our prayers for a quick and decisive victory for Israel over Iran and Hamas, for refuah shlema to those who have been wounded, and for the speedy release of the remaining hostages in Gaza. Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Tali Rosenbaum, and I am very excited to introduce a guest today, Dr. Sara Glass, who is the author of the best-selling book, Kissing Girls on Shabbat.
We'll get to the interview in just a moment. First, remember to check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archives, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Please subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review, and leave a comment as well. Make sure to tell people about Intimate Judaism and share the podcast so we can continue to grow our audience. And I don't want to waste any time with anything except for speaking with our very, very interesting guest. So I'm going to introduce her right now. Dr. Sara Glass is a psychotherapist, writer, and speaker based in New York City, and the author of a personal memoir, Kissing Girls on Shabbat. You can follow her on Instagram at Dr. Sara Glass, at DrSaraglass. Sara, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm such huge fans of yours. You have no idea. I think this is the way Judaism was meant to be. And, I'm just so glad I can get to be here because all I've ever wanted to do is contribute to making our communities better and safer.
It's very nice to hear you say that. Thank you very much. There's a lot to talk about, and you wrote an entire book on the following question, so this cannot be answered in just a few moments. Nonetheless, I'm going to ask you to give us a brief synopsis of your personal story so that our listeners who haven't yet read your book have an idea of where you're coming from.
Absolutely. So I was raised in Hasidic Brooklyn. Some of your listeners might be familiar with this. It's like I usually have to say what you see in the documentaries, the men in the fur hats, the women in wigs. But, these are Intimate Judaism listeners, so they already know what I'm talking about. And I was raised in the Ger sect within Borough Park, Brooklyn. I went to an all-girls school, and I was raised to be sort of prepared to be married. That was the entire goal of my education. I learned things like how to kosher a chicken, how to fold a fitted sheet, how to send my husband off to learning and support him in his godly work, and just how to be a good wife, all through high school and my 1 year of study in seminary. And I really wanted to be a good Jewish wife. I was so committed to doing that. But I had one problem. I couldn't seem to stop falling in love with girls. And so that became a battle that I faced throughout my adolescence. And then I did get arranged married at 19. I tried so hard to be that perfect Jewish wife. I had 2 children very quickly, back to back. And ultimately, that marriage did not work out, but it took me an additional 10 years to come out of the closet and move to New York City, where I live now. So Kissing Girls on Shabbat spans the beginning, right before my arranged marriage, up until I left, my Orthodox community in order to come out of the closet, which is a shame. It is a shame. And I think we're already making progress in that. I work with Jewish queer youth now, which is such a gift. And I get to be a part of an organization that helps people coexist as Jewish and queer at the same time.
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you for what you said about our podcast, but also thank you for bearing with us. I just want to say you showed so much grace. We had to cancel twice on you, and you were so nice about it. That's so appreciated. I think that there's so much that you can contribute coming from inside the Hasidic community, having spent some time kind of identifying as modern Orthodox, so you're familiar with the modern Orthodox community, and now you've kind of found yourself and you run this psychotherapy practice and you treat trauma, and you're also familiar with trauma, which anybody who reads your book can understand you are kind of experiential familiarity with that. So I think that you are coming with a lot of perspectives that could be really, really helpful. And so since you brought up about being queer and you personally not being able to integrate that in your community, and you kind of said, well, that's a shame. And I know that we're working on more awareness and more acceptance, and that's so important. The question that I would start out with has to do with your way of working. I think I'll stick to women. We've had podcasts where we've talked about homosexuality in men, and we were actually sent feedback a couple times that we really haven't spent enough time talking about what it is to be queer and what it is to be lesbian and what it is to also be so committed to Judaism at the same time. We all know therapists who are very affirming, LGBTQ affirming, and we all know therapists who are, you have a same-sex attraction and you can get over it with certain tactics, or, anyone can change and you can change. And I'm going to guess I know that the way I work is not really with an agenda. And, I do a psychotherapy process and kind of this acceptance of yourself. And then, what do you want to do? And some of my clients want to be married. They want to be married to a man, whether they're at a stage where they've already integrated and accepted the queer parts of themselves, or whether they are not accepting it. They're rejecting it because it can't integrate with their spirituality. So they'll be at different places along the spectrum. But I'm wondering how you work with it based on your personal experience of not integrating, not being able to really integrate it. I'm sure there are other factors there, but how do you work with women who want to stay religious and be able to live with a woman, but also women who want to stay religious and marry to a man?
Mhm. Yes, that's so complicated, and it is something I work with a lot. And I really do appreciate that we're focusing on women in this queer spectrum, because I think there's like that one line in the Torah that says, "Do not lie with a man as you would with another man as you would with a woman," right? And that's what happens is most of these discussions about queerness in Orthodox Judaism, and I've had quite a few, end up being centered on men because of the one line that seems to clarify what the Torah expects of men. And then, sometimes I sit there in the conversation, I'm like, well, there's the rest of the rainbow spectrum. Not everybody is a straight or like a cisgender man in the queer umbrella. So this is so crucial. And you're right, like I do work with it in a more nuanced manner. So since writing the book, I get many referrals. And since my New York Times Modern Love piece came out, from people who are facing this exact dilemma. Some people are already married to men, right? And they're like, what do? I think I'm gay. What a scary question to ask. So, firstly, it's like, for anyone who's asking that question or knows someone who's asking that question, that takes so much bravery and courage to search within yourself and to ask. Even if your intention is to stay married to a man, being honest with yourself will help that marriage. Because when somebody is like queer in a heterosexual marriage, there are little things that start to go wrong in that marriage. I know for me, when I was married to my second husband in the Five Towns, modern Orthodox, he was mostly lovely. Like you'll see if you read the book, it was like most of the story is everyone's a human being, but he was lovely. And our marriage was so tense at times because I was not straight and it was nobody's fault. But once we understood that, it took away like so many of the layers of built up tension. So point of that is to say, like, even if you want to stay married to a man, it's still helpful to be honest with yourself. It helps the communication and the dynamic within your marriage. And the way I work with it is really, like you said, and like the American Psychological Association says, and all the other like ethical boards don't have an agenda. I genuinely don't. Some of my clients will come in and say, I need to stay in this marriage. I have children, etc., or I want to. And I'm like, that's great. You know what you want. Or they'll say, I don't know what I want. And I'll always say the answers are within your own body already. Our job here is to peel away the outside layers and figure out what's in your own body. The last thing the therapist wants to do is become one of those outside layers that detract from somebody listening to their inner voice.
Absolutely. And I just want to add one thing about transparency. In other words, it's also important for your relationship that your partner knows as well, and that you can approach them with your own acceptance of it, and they also may have choices to make.
That's absolutely true, right? Like, and you talk so much about consent, which I've not heard enough of in my own upbringing. I think there's room for improvement, but it's like, yes, then you give your partner a chance to like knowingly consent to staying in the marriage or not.
I was struck when you said that leaving your community was a shame. It was a shame that you had to leave your community. And I guess you'll call it a two-part question based on that. The first part is, what do you mean that it was a shame? In the sense that, do you wish you didn't have to leave? Do you wish you didn't leave? I want to know what that means. And the second part is that I'd like to know in what ways you would have wanted your community, your educators, your family to have acted differently when you were an adolescent and a young adult struggling with your own sexual identity and facing the reality that the community norms would never presumably accept your identity. And I guess in asking this question, I mean, really, what should they or could they have all done differently while maintaining their beliefs, as opposed to saying, well, I wish they would have changed their beliefs? Let's work within the assumption that they're not going to change their beliefs, but what could they have done differently while remaining who they are?
So if we look at it, that's a really good question. If we look at the way, like my Orthodox Jewish communities in which I lived, which would span Hasidic, Yeshivish, and Orthodox, modern Orthodox, I like sort of had to leave all of them at different junctures. And I've worked within all of them as a therapist. Growing up and living in those communities, I never saw an example of queerness. There were no same-sex couples because those people who were like gay had to leave the community in order to exist openly. It was very clear that the community didn't welcome or accept those families. When my children attended yeshiva schools and Orthodox like Beis Yaakov schools, there was no like two mommies, two daddies bringing their kids to school. And so from a very young age, I knew this is not something we do here. In addition, like what's really complicated is when love and financial security are tied to one's identity. And so for me, the love of my family, I knew like was tied to me being a straight person who was Orthodox presenting both. And housing, like, can't be understated. If we look at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, your bottom layer of needs that you need to survive is like food, shelter, clothing, to just get through the day. So as someone who worked in the Orthodox community, I knew that if I were to come out of the closet, I could lose my job and I wouldn't have a way to pay rent or like for a mortgage for a place for my children and myself to live. And so those things made it really complicated for me to consider staying. I just needed to survive. I needed my children to have food on the table. And I needed to be in a place where in my life where like my housing and shelter like wasn't dependent on me being straight. And I think in our communities, we don't do a real, like often we don't do a good enough job communicating to children, teens, and adults that number one, we will love you no matter what. We will love you. Number two, you will always have a place to be. You can come home. You can come to our home. You can have a job, even if you're not straight. Like this is not about changing our beliefs. This is about how we treat people who are queer.
Wow, there's quite a lot to say about all the kind of work that needs to be done in this area. I want to move away from talking about specifically the sexual orientation and just talk in general about navigating sexuality when you've been raised in whether it's the Hasidic community or even the modern Orthodox community. There are changes that people do make for various reasons, one of them being sexual orientation, but there are other reasons that people may either become less observant over time or not observant at all over time. They're not all trauma. Some of them are, but some of them are also cognitive beliefs. And like when they are trauma, this will be even exaggerated what I'm about to say, because navigating the outside world is risky. And even in your book, you talk about how you seem to be searching for love and searching for intimacy, but you did find danger. I do see that as well in my practice, that young people who go out to explore, one of the first places that they explore is in the sexual arena to the extent that it's so extreme that there's like these Shabbatot, what was it called, Scott?
Sinner's Shabbos or something like
Sinners
that.
Shabbat. Yeah, like really what I wanted to talk about was like, what are the risks that you've seen in navigating sexual relationships kind of on the outside when your knowledge about sex or your boundaries are no longer, being Shomer Negia and Shomer Yichud and tznius. There's actually other elements to having a safe and healthy sexual relationship, but, nobody's been told that or knows that going in. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. It's also really important because parents sometimes ask me, my children or my child is not religious anymore and they want to bring their girlfriend home and they sleep together. Do I let them sleep together in the house? Do I not? How do we talk about it? So I think that this is a subject that may be very useful for listeners to open up here.
Yes. Oh, I could talk about this for 3 days, but let me talk about it from two different angles. One is as a therapist in the when I was in the Orthodox community, I participated in the Aleinu and then Magenu program, which educated young children on body autonomy and safety, started by Debbie Fox out of LA, and then it was like taken throughout the States and probably Israel. And we went into schools and talked to teachers. We did 3 parts, teachers, parents, and students, about like, what does it mean to feel safe in your body? What are things that you can do to feel safer? That's still relatively new. Our communities are sort of catching up. To give us a lot of credit, look how much progress has been made. And people always ask me, they're like, do you think there's hope for queer people within Orthodoxy? And I say, absolutely, because as a therapist of over 2 decades in the Orthodox Jewish community, I've seen so much growth in the arena of sexual abuse treatment and prevention. It used to be like that people would come in for treatment of sexual abuse when they were about to get married, and they would say, this thing happened to my kid when they were 5. Can you just quickly treat it so I can marry her off? And let's not talk about it ever again. And now, years later, parents come to me with that 5-year-old, and say, I think something may have happened. Can you evaluate? And let's get it out in the open and report the abuser. So like, look at what we've done. We have whole organizations that pay me sometimes to treat these kids. It's just unbelievable. So we're getting there. At the same time, with the way I was raised in terms of body awareness, I was raised with a tremendous amount of dissociation. I was taught from a very young age that my body was a vessel for God. It wasn't important. It was irrelevant. So to that end, I was dressed in like long tights and skirts from the age of 3 and up. My school did not have sports. We didn't have music. We didn't really engage with our physical bodies. We just like sat in a desk and then you're allowed to throw a ball around at recess time. But we didn't dance enough. There's dance in high school if you got into dance and somehow magically learned how to dance for the Beis Yaakov play. But, we didn't like live in our bodies in the way children do out in the secular world. And then the whole other part is like, your body is going to get married to a man, for people who are assigned female at birth. So like, you already know what's going to happen. There's no exploration to be done. And so what that does is for people who do get married off, or even people who leave the community without getting married off, is you're sort of leaving without your body. You don't really know what your body likes and doesn't like. So you're just like careening around in the dark like a car with no headlights, trying not to crash into a tree and like find some safe patch of road out there. As you might see in the book, I included this scene where I dated a Jewish man who held me at gunpoint, literally held me at gunpoint. And all I knew was like my teachings. And so I had this line in my head, Isha Kashira, Asa Ritzon Bala, a Jewish woman does the will of her man, of her husband. And so he had this gun to my head, and I'm like, okay, I have to make him feel good about this. This is his choice. I need to support him, which is not Judaism. I don't believe. That is not what we're trying to embody in Judaism. That is like a system within which information is so restricted that it does create danger.
Thank you for that. I mean, in some ways, we know this from the ones who stay in as well. You know, you get married and you do what your husband wants without necessarily having an expectation for boundaries, for consent, for pleasure. But I guess what I'm interested in is the experience of the quote unquote off the derech, off the derech sexuality, what that's about, why it often goes straight there to these kind of dangerous places, often extreme. What's the draw to that? Is it because there's so much sexual repression that leaving creates this desire for a sexual freedom that almost feels overwhelming? And also, like, you could be having a lot of sex, but not necessarily feeling anything, like you said, dissociated, not knowing even what an orgasm is, so not having any expectation for pleasure. And this is in the secular world. So I have had Hasidic women who have been very vulnerable to like healers, tantric healers, different kinds of like for some reason, that's where they go. They go to places where it's very alternative. And I guess if you grew up with boundaries and expectations and ability to see the dangers, not the dangers that you were taught about as a child, but like relational dangers. That's what I was wondering more about, this kind of the navigation of sexuality once you're no longer religious.
So I think it's so complicated, and there are probably so many answers. Like one would be, what we talk about when people were liberated from Holocaust concentration camps, they had a hard time navigating their exposure to food and would often overeat. And some people died from eating too much too fast once they had food because they had been starving for so long, and their bodies and systems didn't know how to regulate eating. Right. And so the food wasn't the problem. It was the restriction before the access to food. So there's a possibility, like for some people, it's like they feel so repressed that they're like, well, now I need as much of this as possible. In my experience, it's most often not about the sex. Sometimes it is for some people, and that's okay. It's the people who leave and just want to have the pleasure of sex. Sometimes it's like our algorithms, if we look at social media and media in general, and I also did my dissertation on the study of popular media in American and Western culture, our algorithms are all skewed. The things we see on screens are not representative of actual real life. Everything is more extreme. I remember the first time I watched TV, I saw Grey's Anatomy. I was 24 years old. I had never seen anything on a screen. And I was like, wow, is everybody outside in the world so perfect? Does nobody have a wrinkle? Does nobody have a gray hair? Like, I didn't understand what was going on and why everything looked so shiny when, like, I lived in a world with real people who were just, regular women. Um, and it's gotten even worse and worse to the point where social media is like a distortion of reality. And so if you come from a world that's like living under a rock, sheltered, enclosed, and your first exposure is on a screen, often hidden in your closet, in your room at night where you've managed to hook up Wi-Fi, what you're seeing is two opposite sides of an extreme spectrum, and you're not actually learning how to regulate your body in the real world, but you think it's the real world because it's on TV. And so that creates, I think, that issue where people are going to the most extreme level.
Seems to me like there's a real need for like workshops on navigating sexuality. Do they do that, as far as you know, I guess there are organizations that help the formerly religious kind of mainstream into general society. Would that be part of that?
So they do that at Footsteps, and just a shout out to Footsteps. People always like the stigma is Footsteps takes people away from Orthodox Judaism. They really don't. They just try to keep people alive through the transition and safe through the transition. If someone chooses to make the transition, Footsteps wants to make sure they have community, they have sex ed, they have housing, so people don't end up in these horrible, dangerous situations. And they do that. I often will do that in session. Like my clients who are ex-Orthodox will come in and say, I'm dating this guy. And I'm like, okay, I just want to make sure you're aware of condoms. I'm like, I know it's not quite my role, but I also know that for where you're coming from, you may not have this information. They oftentimes don't.
Right.
Sarah, I want to ask you a couple questions, almost follow-up questions about your education when you were younger, because first of all, I'll commend you in your book. One thing which I found very interesting was that it was very nuanced, your portrayal of the way people acted. So, for example, your college teacher, I don't remember the name you gave her, but the college teacher clearly knew a lot more than a lot of other people, including the rabbis, about what was okay and what wasn't. And she was very upset about some of your experiences. And in fact, it sounds like upset with you for not telling her earlier that you were having certain problems that shouldn't have taken place. And I commend you on having such a nuanced portrayal, but it does raise the question about the nature of education. So I really have two questions here. I'll ask them one by one. The first question is, given what I just said about the college teacher and what you didn't know, and for example, you described your first husband when you were in Nida, when you were unable to be together after having your period, that he wouldn't even really look at you or smile at you. He was emotionally distant in addition to being physically distant. So what are examples of Kala education, of premarital education that you think could be different and should be different in Hasidic communities and Orthodox communities in general that we're just getting wrong in terms of how we're educating our kids?
That's a great question. I think we're already doing better. I was educated in 2004. So that's a long time ago. I hope that there's more focus now on female pleasure and in sexuality and on consent. In terms of like my education, I just learned you have to do this twice a week. This is the position you'll be in. And it was like very vague. It was like trying to tell someone how to build a car without saying aluminum or wheels or, engine. It's like, do me this thing. It'll move if you do all the things right. And that's great. And call me if you have any questions. You're like, I still don't know how to build a car. So that was sort of the extent of my sex ed. And I hope that we now teach young girls, like, if you're not feeling comfortable, if you're not feeling in the mood, if you're feeling sad or anxious, like, here are some things you can do. And you don't have to have sex with your husband if you don't want to. If he's demanding that, that's a problem. And the two of you can access all these resources to navigate it.
I remember that you wrote also that when I think you were in Rutgers in graduate school, they were talking about marital rape. You didn't understand the concept because you said, I'm owned by my husband. What does that even mean?
Exactly. I mean, would you say that we're doing better now? Like, I'm not like so updated. Are you feeling like it's getting a little better? Or do you feel like this is still a huge issue?
In my experience, I'm
Yes.
probably the wrong person to ask because I'm not from the Hasidic community, but I think that at least in the centrist or modern Orthodox world, yes, I do think things are getting better. There's more awareness that education has to be better and can't only be only about halakha. It can't only be about Jewish law. Of course, that carries its own dangers, as I've mentioned before in this podcast, and so has Tali, which is that people who don't have the requisite knowledge might be teaching things that are non-halachic also, and they're just wrong. They're teaching things that they have no business teaching. So that carries its own problems as well. But at least the idea that premarital education can't simply be, as you said, trying to build a car without knowing the first thing about it, I think we've progressed, at least in the knowledge that has to be more than that. I'd like to ask another question also, though. I'm curious about language, because you also say that you didn't have language to understand who you were, your same-sex attraction, even the idea of orgasm. These were not words that meant anything to you. The reason I'm interested in this is that Tali and I have been saying for a long time that we think that calling things by their proper names and using proper language is something which is not just desirable, but necessary. I wanted to know if you think that's true and if having the proper language would have helped you in some way, or is that more of an incidental problem?
Oh, I think having language is everything. When we talk about the problem with banning books in the world and banning media, well, look what regimes try to do, totalitarian regimes. They try to restrict our access to information and language, because when you don't have language with which to express something, your brain can only grow in the direction like of the amount of space it's been given. And without language, we are lost in like this realm of trying to validate our own experiences and know that they matter and they're real. This is also similarly when we talk about like our Torah, like from what I've seen, aside from auxiliary texts, does not mention lesbians. And so in a way, it's sort of like delegitimizing. It's minimizing. It's like you guys don't even, you're not even important enough for us to make a whole sin about you. You just, it's fine. Whatever you do is like child's play. It's not real. That's what it can feel like. It's like, okay, well, then if it's not real, I should be able to fight this urge easily because it doesn't even really exist. You didn't even give me a line about it in Tanakh. So, like, how bad could this temptation be? I should have gotten rid of it a long time ago. And I can get married to a man and it's fine because this is not real. It's not in the language of our holy texts. So, I think like, and then, calling things by the right body parts, of course. I work with kids who've been sexually abused, and I know it's like a little darker, but one of the problems we have is these parents that give their children euphemisms to discuss their private parts. Like we had this little girl come into one of our centers who was taught that her vagina should be called pocketbook. And so when she came home from school and said, someone touched my pocketbook, I didn't like someone trying to, like nobody understood what that meant. Teachers didn't know what that meant. And that can be dangerous. You need to teach little girls to say that their vagina is their vagina so that when they try to go to a safe adult and say it hurts or I have an itch or somebody tried to touch it, the other person knows what they're talking about.
I think you're making such an important point, Sarah, about language, not having the proper language or having confusing language. But what you were saying before about not even having a language or a concept about women being sexual with women, that it's not referred to in the Torah the way that it's referred to with men. While it's true that there isn't a Torah prohibition that's spelled out in the written Torah the way that it is for men, there are rabbinic sources and they discuss women lying together. So the concept was not foreign to the rabbis. And I don't think that they saw this as proper behavior. It seems that as a young religious girl experimenting with your friend Dasa, you definitely had the feeling that you were doing something that was wrong or that was not sanua. Am I right?
Right.
I think if I recall from the book, you said that a certain rabbi said to you something like, it may not be a Torah prohibition, but it's disgusting. I think that's the
Right.
term which I
Right.
remember.
Oh, wow.
You're really disgusting. Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah.
That should have been the title of my book, Merely Disgusting.
Merely disgusting. Yeah. Recently in Israel, a doctoral student who is a sexual educator, a well-known sexual educator, did a study of sexuality in religious youth and looked at young women. They looked at sexual experiences, and I don't remember the exact statistic, but there was a significant statistic of young women who have had sexual experiences with other young women. Those experiences were more likely to take place amongst young women who were in same-sex frameworks, as opposed to young women who were in mixed gender schools. So, and that I guess was thought to be a pretty, like duh, obvious kind of thing. But she also demonstrated in her study or discussed in her study that a significant portion of these young women went on to get married and don't identify as gay in any way. I guess I'm wondering about the concept of fluidity and how it may be kind of used to the advantage of perhaps educators. I don't want to say therapists because I'm hoping that that wouldn't be the case, but those who really want to help people not be gay because it's hard to be gay and religious. And so I wonder what you have to say about that. I'm not saying that this particular study has an agenda. I'm not. I'm just saying that I could see where those statistics could be quoted to help young women by saying, no, 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 a lot of young women fool around together in high school, and that doesn't mean you're going to be gay or doesn't mean you are. Wondering if you could talk about that concept, and maybe you're familiar with Lisa Diamond and her work. She's a researcher, and she has researched for decades queer and lesbian women and their fluidity. I was wondering about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. My brain is breaking a little bit hearing the study because I'm so angry, but I'm such a therapist, so I'm just sitting here. But I think I saw it posted and I wanted to do a response, and I'm like, I need to calm down. I can't record anything right now. I need to. It's such a fine line between like hearing some things that are like, okay, I know the right is going to misuse this. And I can tell, I hear all the rhetoric in my head. They're going to say, like, this isn't real. You can stamp it out of existence. And it's like, this is what's happening in America right now. We're trying to say trans people don't exist. And like, as if we think that's going to make trans people go away, who've been around for generations and decades and centuries. The bigger question I have when I think about that study my working theory would be sexuality is fluid. Even gender identity is fluid. People, I think most people are probably not 100% straight or even 100% gay. People are complicated. Even like someone who's really straight, like a straight woman who's married to a man and has always had crushes on men, might see someone pass them on the subway who's a woman and be like, that person's attractive. Doesn't mean they're gay, but doesn't mean that like maybe they would enjoy having a physical encounter with that woman. Maybe. Now, that's like a normal level of fluidity. It's like if we think about the foods we like to eat. Some people love to eat steak, some people love to eat salad, some people love sweets. Does that mean if you're like a sweets person that you never want to have a bite of steak? Like we don't expect people to fit strongly into one category in any other arena. If you love to wear like formal suits, does that mean I'll never catch you in a baseball cap? No, that would be ridiculous. We understand that people have a span within themselves, that we're capable, we're beautiful human beings, we're complicated, we can hold so much within ourselves. So whose agenda does it serve when we try to say otherwise with regard to sexual and gender orientation? Why are we doing that? Why? And that's a larger question.
Thank you.
Okay, Sarah, I want to go back to what Tali mentioned before about your relationship with Dasa and the other ways in which you found yourself an outlier in your Ger Hasidic community growing up. And perhaps this is a question which is not answerable, or maybe you can't answer it, but I'd like to ask it anyway to find out. I'm curious about how much of an outlier you were in the Hasidic community, in your opinion. In other words, you felt probably the way most people who are doing something which is against the rules, quote unquote, feel that you are the only one, or you and the person you were interested in were the only ones in a mass of people who are all following the rules properly. And you presented a public face of following the rules, not only properly, but you were machmir, you were stringent, you were someone who was very strong in your Judaism, and you had this secret. And I'm wondering about, is that more common than people might think? I don't necessarily mean specifically with sexual encounters, although I include that, but in general, behind the face of what looks like a monolithic community where people are all following the same rules and believing the same things, how much are people perhaps behind the scenes doing things differently in a very, very tiny way? I'll mention something which is not at all comparable. My wife has some Satmar cousins, and they used to go to my wife's grandmother's house to watch TV, because they couldn't have a TV, but they wanted to watch TV. Obviously, that's not a tremendously scandalous thing, but it's an example where the official communal norms and what they actually wanted to do and thought was okay didn't totally fit. And that can be a spectrum of how serious those differentiations can be. So do you have any sense of how different the public face is from what's going on behind the scenes?
This is a study I want to perform, and here's the study I want to perform. I want to say, how religious are you? Like, let's do a survey. And if there was no consequence to you changing that, no consequence with regard to your job, your family, your marriage, your community, your parents' love for you, how much of that would you still do? And because unfortunately, like so much safety and family and community is tied to religiosity, we don't have a clear sense of it. However, I will say I get so many messages every day on social media from people whose lives are misaligned with how they feel on the inside. And they're constantly reaching out just to say, I wish I could get divorced, but I can't. I'm not, they'll reach out on Friday night. My family's at Shabbat dinner. And I just read your book and wanted to tell you I connected so much with your words, and I know, like, I've been in that household. I know what that means. Your family's at Shabbat dinner, you're Orthodox, it's Friday night, you snuck away, you're on your phone, like you're not feeling like that lifestyle is really yours. So I do get a lot of messages about it. And maybe one day we could do that study. We don't really have a sense of like how much people are choosing the lifestyle when we have so many consequences attached.
Interesting. Thanks.
I actually think that what you're talking about really is how can you be authentic? How can you live your authentic life and not feel oppressed or repressed? And a lot of it is kind of what you said earlier. There's punishment, there's consequence. there's consequence, along the spectrum. So if in the very, very Hasidic communities, there's tremendous consequence because right away it's a consequence on your kids. They're not going to get the shidduchim, or they're not going to get into the schools, or and if you want a smartphone, there's going to be a price to pay. That's going to be a very high level. But even as you go through Orthodoxy, even if you're the most modern, you have what to lose if you opt out in some way. And the more you have to lose, the less you'll be likely to make that transition and to kind of feel oppressed. And I think that the important message here is that you have to be able to accept where you are. No system is really perfect. So even if you do have criticism of your way of life, but it's still the way of life that you identify with, and it's not a way of life that you want to pay the price to leave. Now when you're talking about your sexuality, that's huge. That's not something you can easily just say, I can deal with that. I mean, if you're talking about like, not liking how high the mechitza is in shul or whatever, then that's something you can live with. You're not, or find a place to go if there's another place to go. There are things you can do. But sexuality is a very hard one. It's a very difficult one. And I think that having that ability to integrate, to know that you can be who you authentically are, and you still have the entitlement to hold on to your religious experience. You might have to do some work. You might have to pick a bone with your creator for making you this way. And you might have some issues with Hashem, and you have to work through them, but you still can live an authentic Jewish life and embrace your sexuality. And they might say, yeah, but you don't have shlemut. You don't get to that place of being able to create a sacred bond, because the only sacred bond you can create is with a man. And yeah, it's true that we have to grieve for something in that choice making. So Scott, you were going to ask something?
Well, I just wanted to comment, and I really would like to hear, Sarah, if you agree with this. But one thing that I took out, a message that I took out, that perhaps people listening who educate in the Orthodox world might be wondering what they can do to make people feel less afraid, or to be more welcoming, to allow them to be themselves without giving up on their own values. One thing that I was struck by was the God that you were taught is a God of fear. And you say that explicitly, whether it's fear of heaven, fear of punishment. You talk a lot about the punishments that you're going to get for the various misdeeds that one can possibly do. And without denying that that is part of Judaism, I don't want to falsify sources or pretend that something that is there actually isn't there. It is there. We also have a God of love. And perhaps the de-emphasis on love and the overemphasis on fear can be a negative experience for people. And I think in many communities, this is the way things are moving. I think it probably would be helpful for us to try to work primarily with a God, not of guilt, but a God who loves us and accepts us, even as he wants us to follow his mitzvot and wants us to follow the Torah, but from a position of love rather than a position of, if you don't do this, you're going to go to hell.
Absolutely. I was in this very unique place because usually when you think of Hasidim, they're so warm and loving. And I was in this like ger is like we call kalta gerers. We're like a cold, we're like almost a Litvish Hasidish. So we have all the coldness of like not being Hasidish with all the rules of being Hasidish. And that resulted in this like cataclysmic, void of fear and darkness. And it's atypical. But yes, I think speaking about love more, and also the way in which we speak about people who deviate. So when somebody leaves the community, we don't need to say, like, if this is not within your belief system, what the person who left is doing, you don't need to say, I endorse that person's decision to not keep Shabbat. You don't have to say that, but try to speak about them respectfully. Like, okay, so, Shlomo made another choice and we love him. That's not our choice, but we still love Shlomo and we hope he's doing well. Right? Instead of like how we talk about people who aren't religious in these communities, or people who differ will be like, oh, that guy, he's bad news, right?
Or crazy, or crazy.
Or crazy. So
Yeah.
if we can just like, we don't have to endorse it. It's okay. But if you can just be respectful and kind, then your child, what you're doing is telling your child, if you don't agree, like if you need to leave for any reason, you're safe to call me. You don't need to be on the road. That's what that is.
I think one of the most important moments for me as an educator years ago was when I finally decoupled acceptance and approval. We often think that accepting means approving, and that's not necessarily the case. We can accept and love unconditionally. It doesn't mean I have to agree with every one of your choices.
Exactly. Exactly.
I think the message here for parents is love your children and accept your children. And if they come to you with issues of identity, whether it's a queer identity, you're not straight, or issues of religious identity. First of all, don't take it personally. They're not doing it in order to rebel against you. It's not about you. And love them and accept them and give them a place to be who they are. That doesn't mean you don't have a grief process. That doesn't mean you're not going to be sad about it. You raise your children a certain way, and if they don't embrace those values, it is a loss. And I think we have to absolutely acknowledge that loss. The sadness is real, and you can hold both. You can hold both feelings of sadness, feelings of betrayal, feelings of anger, and at the same time, you can be there, be that secure attachment for your child. And that way they won't be in danger because they'll be able to come to you and talk to you. I remember like a 45-year-old religious mother who told me that she took her daughter to the gynecologist for birth control. And she was very proud of herself for doing that because she didn't agree with her decision to become sexually active. But once she was going to do it, she was going to make sure she was going to do it safely. And that was really touching. It was a really moving conversation. Sara, we're going to wrap up. I'm wondering if you could just take the last couple minutes to add anything to this that you would have liked to say, didn't get to say, that you think is also important. You know, you've got an audience here. We're pretty much the spectrum. Tell us what you'd like to tell us.
Yes, I'm so glad to be here. I was afraid when I wrote my book that it would be so distancing from the Jewish community I love so dearly, and that I wouldn't be able to get my messages within. People asked me, what do you want out of this book? And I said, I want to reach 15-year-old me. I want to help her. I'm not doing this so that the rest of the world could be like, oh, great, look at you. You know, I didn't want to fit that narrative of you left and now you're a hero and those people are all bad. That's not what this is. This is about, I suffered. I know you. I know my Orthodox community. You are loving. You are kind. You can do more than you think. And if you take my story as a cautionary tale, that's okay. Do that, because that is like kind of what it is. It doesn't have to be this way. Your children shouldn't have to go through what I went through. You shouldn't have to go through that. You can have all your beautiful values and family and community like traditions, and also try to make sure nobody else has to suffer in silence or get put in danger.
Amen. Beautiful.
Sara, thank you so much for joining us. This is very meaningful, and it's a pleasure meeting you, and I think your message really resonates, and I hope a lot of people will listen and read the book as well. Dr. Sara Glass, I appreciate your joining us today.
Thank you so much. Find me on social media at Dr. Sara Glass for more behind the scenes like information and all the upcoming events and projects. Thank you.
Remember to go to our website, intimatejudaism.com, share the podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.